The iron scrolls arrived in Heron's Crossing on a morning that smelled like rain that had forgotten to fall. The sky had been the color of old pewter since dawn, pressing low over the valley the way a hand presses over a candle flame, not quite extinguishing it, but making the light small and uncertain. The river, which ran gray-green in summer and a clean sharp silver in winter, had taken on that particular flat color it wore in the weeks between seasons, when the world seemed to be waiting for permission to become something definite. Crows sat on the mill roof in a row and said nothing. The weather vane shaped like a rooster on the Fenn family house had stopped turning, as if the wind itself had paused to hear what was coming. The Imperial courier rode in from the eastern road just as the morning market was setting out its first tables. Old, wherein the herbalist arranging her bundles of dried sage and pennyroyal, the Marsh brothers stacking rounds of pale hard cheese on a cloth, young Corin from the tanner's family dragging a folding frame with belts and bootstraps across the mud. They all stopped when they heard the horse. It was not the horse itself that stopped them. Horses came through Heron's Crossing regularly enough. The road was not important, but it connected two places that were, and travelers passed. It was the sound of the horse, the particular clipped, trained rhythm of a courier's mount, the hooves hitting cobblestone in the way that said, "I am going somewhere official, stand aside." The whole market, which had only barely begun to be a market, went quiet and watched. The courier was young, younger than his uniform seemed to know, the imperial gray hanging stiffly on a frame still not quite filled out to its suggestions. He had the expression of someone who had been given a task of great solemnity and was determined to be equal to it. He rode to the village center, to the notice board beside the well, and he dismounted with the careful precision of a man aware he was being watched. From his saddlebag he produced a scroll. Was iron genuinely iron, thin hammered to something close to a sheet, dark and dull and heavy, the kind of material chosen not for practicality but for message? Paper rots, parchment burns, iron endures. Whoever had made the decision to use iron for these scrolls had been making a point about the permanence of the Empire's intentions, and even in a village like Heron's Crossing, where ironwork meant plowshares and hinges and nails, the people watching understood the vocabulary of the material. The courier nailed the scroll to the board with 4 sharp strikes of a small hammer. He remounted without a word. He rode on. For a moment no one moved. Then old Warren put down her sage and walked to the board, because Warren was the one who always walked first toward things other people were still deciding whether to approach. She had her letters, which was more than could be said for everyone. She stood before the board and read the scroll in silence, her lips pressing together in a way that communicated a great deal before she had said a single word. Then she turned around and said in her dry particular voice, "It's the Dragon Edict." The village had of course heard. Villages hear everything. They are organisms of communal knowledge, and news, especially terrible news, moves through them the way water moves through soil, finding every crack and crevice. Everyone in Heron's Crossing had heard something about the Imperial Dragon Edict, the way everyone in any small and distant place has heard something about the large and terrible things happening in the world beyond their roads. They had heard fragments, contradictions, rumors softened or sharpened in the retelling. They had heard it was only about the great mountain dragons. They had heard it was about all of them. They had heard there were exceptions for domestic breeds used in agriculture. They had heard there were no exceptions. The scroll clarified. All dragons, it said, in any form, of any size, of any color. The language was careful and total, the language of people who had learned to close loopholes. Any creature possessing draconic origin, draconic characteristic, or draconic capacity, whether flying or earthbound, whether fire-bearing or otherwise, whether fully manifested or in a state of youth or dormancy, shall be surrendered to the nearest imperial garrison within 40 days of this notice, or destroyed at the discretion of the surrendering party, at the discretion of imperial hunters upon discovery, or at the discretion of any citizen acting in the service of imperial law. Concealment of such creatures, willful or otherwise, shall be considered a crime against the crown, punishable at the crown's discretion. By order of His Imperial Majesty, Emperor Vale the Unbowed, in the 42nd year of his reign. Old Warren read the whole thing aloud once in her flat, dry voice that did not editorialize, because editorializing was not necessary. When she finished, she folded her hands in front of her and looked at no one in particular, which was another form of editorializing. The market did not properly become a market that morning. People collected their goods quietly, said a few words to each other in low voices, and went home. There was no dramatic outcry. There were no tears, no arguments, no speeches. Heron's Crossing was a practical place populated by practical people who had survived 3 floods, 2 droughts, and 1 imperial taxation reform that had essentially broken the eastern farms for a generation. And they had survived all of these things by going home, sitting down, looking at what they had, and thinking clearly about what the new situation required. The practical thinking was already beginning before the morning's first rain finally arrived. Sable Fenn had not been at the market. She had been upstairs in her room at the window watching the clouds, in the particular way she had of watching the clouds that was not really about the clouds at all but about the creature on the sill in front of her. Pip had been restless since dawn. He could feel changes in the air before they arrived. She had noticed this about him early, the way he grew still before rain, the way he angled his face toward the south before a cold wind came down from the mountains. He was, she had come to understand, not simply more sensitive than a normal lizard. He was sensitive to things that were not quite weather, to shifts in the texture of the world that she had no name for, that she could only observe through the evidence of his attention. This morning he had been turning his head toward the eastern road for an hour before the courier arrived. She had watched him do it with the mixture of admiration and cold fear that had become, over 3 years, simply the ordinary compound emotion of knowing him. He was extraordinary and she loved him completely, and his extraordinariness was the thing most likely to get him killed. These three facts coexisted in her daily without resolution. She had stopped expecting them to resolve. She heard eventually the hammer strikes at the notice board. She did not go down to look at the scroll because she was 11 years old and did not attend the market without her mother, and her mother had not called for her. But she heard the market go quiet, that particular quality of outdoor silence that is not the absence of sound but the suspension of it, and she understood, in the way children understand things they have no language for yet, that something had shifted. Pip turned away from the eastern road finally and looked at her. She looked back at him. He was, to all observable purposes, a very ordinary lizard. This was the most extraordinary thing about him, and she had thought about it often enough that it had become something close to philosophical. That the deepest form of concealment was not hiding but blending, not absence but a kind of aggressive ordinariness so thorough, and so committed that it defeated curiosity before curiosity could begin. Pip's scales were brown. Not the interesting, iridescent brown of certain beetles, not the rich dark brown of good river mud in summer, just brown, the color of things that are brown because that is what the world expects them to be and they have no reason to argue. His body was compact and low to the sill. His movements when he moved were the small unhurried movements of an animal that has nowhere important to be. He could, when he tried, pass for a decorative ceramic figure. She had tested this. She had placed him on her mother's shelf among the actual ceramic figures, a shepherdess, a small glazed owl, a rounded pot shaped vaguely like a sleeping cat, and had brought 3 separate people into the room on invented pretexts and watched their eyes move across the shelf. None of them had stopped at Pip. One woman, the baker's wife, had even reached past him to pick up the glazed owl for a closer look. Pip sitting 3 inches to her left, breathing, his amber eyes open, and she had not seen him. The best hiding place, her grandmother had said, her grandmother who was dead now 3 years, who had told her many things in the compressed, urgent manner of people who are running out of time, is somewhere no one thinks to look. The rest of that conversation she remembered in fragments, the way all conversations that matter tend to dissolve and reform in memory. Not behind things, not underneath, right in front, right in their eyes. The eye passes over what the mind has already decided isn't there. She had been 8 when her grandmother said this. She had not known then that she was going to need the advice. She had not known Pip yet. Pip was still in his egg. She had found him 14 months after her grandmother died, which placed the discovery roughly in the early days of what would turn out to be a hot and difficult summer. The river had been low that year, drawn back from its usual banks to expose a long shelf of grayish stones and the particular mud that lives beneath river water, dark and rich and smelling of something ancient. She'd been walking the exposed bank alone. She was allowed to walk the bank alone, being 9 by that point and considered sensible by her parents who were right. And she'd been collecting interesting stones in her apron pocket because that was the kind of child she was. The kind who noticed things, who kept things, who found in the specific and the small a satisfaction that the general and the large had never quite provided. The egg had been sitting in a hollow between 2 exposed roots of the great willow that grew at the river's bend, the tree that everyone in Heron's Crossing called simply the Old Willow, as if there were no other willows in the world, and perhaps for the purposes of Heron's Crossing there weren't. The hollow was bone dry. The water had receded far enough to leave it entirely above the waterline, and the egg sat in it with the absolute self-possession of an object that knows exactly where it belongs. It was the size of a large fist, maybe a shade larger. The shell was a matte gray-brown, the color of the river stones around it, sitting among the river stones around it, indistinguishable from the river stones around it if you had not happened to be 9 years old and constitutionally incapable of passing an interesting collection of stones without looking at each one individually. She had looked at each one individually. She had picked it up. She knew immediately that it was warm. River stones in summer are warm on their surfaces, warmed by direct sun in the way of inert things that take heat passively, but this warmth was different in the way that all the most important differences turn out to be fundamental rather than superficial. It was warm from inside. Not feverish, not alarmingly hot, not the dry external heat of sun-soaked stone. An interior warmth even radiating outward, alive in the truest sense of that word, not just living but live, charged with the specific energy of something that has decided to become itself and is in the process of doing so. She had held it in both hands for a long moment. The knowledge that arrived was not knowledge she had been taught or could have articulated. It was the kind of knowledge that bypasses the part of the mind that requires things to be explained and arrives directly in the chest, fully formed and irrevocable. She knew what it was. She knew she was going to take it home. She knew she was not going to tell anyone, and that this not telling was going to be one of the defining acts of her life from this point forward, a shape around which many other things were going to have to arrange themselves. She had put it in her apron pocket among the interesting stones, and she had walked home and she had gone upstairs. She had not told anyone. It had hatched 3 days later. In the clay pot, she had lined with torn pieces of her second-worst wool undershirt, having reasoned that if anyone found the nesting material later, she could explain away the pot more easily than she could explain away a constructed wooden box which would imply deliberate preparation. She had been awake for both nights prior, lying in her bed pretending to sleep while actually listening for what she wasn't certain since she had no experience of dragon eggs hatching, and the hatching when it came was quieter than she'd expected. There was a small sound, then a smaller one. Then a series of sounds that were less than sounds, more like the whispers that cracks make in plaster as a wall settles, and then a pause, and then nothing. And she had sat up in the dark and crossed the floor on her bare feet to the windowsill where the pot sat in the ambient gray light of a clouded-over half-moon. The egg was in pieces, the pieces were wet. Pip was sitting in the middle of the pieces, regarding the world. He was impossibly small, the length of her hand. His scales were still soft and dark with the moisture of the egg, and his eyes were open and amber and they looked directly at her with an attention so clear and total that she had the strong brief sensation of being seen by something that was seeing her specifically. Not a child in a dark room, not a human being, not an undifferentiated representative of a species. But her, Sable, the specific and particular person standing here at this specific and particular moment. She held out her hand. He stepped onto it. That was all, that was the whole thing. She had understood in that moment the nature of what she was accepting, and she had not flinched from it. She was 9 years old, and she had made the most consequential decision of her life with the clear-eyed certainty that 9-year-olds sometimes possess about the things that actually matter. A certainty that tends to erode with age and education, and the accumulating fear of consequences, but is, in those early years, quite pure. She had taken him on. Whatever came with him, she had taken on. 3 years later, holding Pip in her hands as the distant sound of the courier's horse faded down the eastern road, she returned to that moment often. Not with regret, never with regret, not even now, not even with an iron scroll nailed to the village notice board and the word concealment printed on it in the Empire's careful hand. With a kind of sober clarity, the clarity of someone who has chosen something fully and lives with the fullness of that choice. There are people who make choices and then spend their lives quietly trying to unchoose them, filing the edges down to something more manageable. She was not that kind of person. She had understood this about herself early. She was the kind of person who chose a thing and then figured out how to live with having chosen it. "You have to stop," she told him that evening. She had come home from her mother's account of the scroll. Her mother had explained it carefully, in the measured and serious tone she used for things she considered important, sitting across the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup of cooling tea. And she had gone upstairs without dinner, which her mother had allowed because her mother could read her well enough to know when she needed to process privately. Sable had gone upstairs, closed her door, sat cross-legged on her bed, and looked at Pip for a long time in silence before she spoke. Pip was on the sill. The evening light was gold and low. He was doing the thing he sometimes did in the evening light, which was to angle his face into it with an expression of such thoroughgoing contentment that it was almost indistinguishable from sleep. He was the color of the old clay pot beneath him, the color of the wooden sill, the color of the reddish-brown river mud. He was very still. In the golden evening on the old wooden sill, he looked like part of the house. She had watched him charring the edge of her bedroll 3 nights running now. Small things, a darkening of the wool, a smell of scorched fiber, a smudge of ash no bigger than her thumb. She'd been smoothing the singed edges down with a river stone and hopping her mother didn't notice. She had attributed it twice to her own carelessness with the bedside candle. She was not sure she'd been believed. "I know you don't do it on purpose," she said, keeping her voice low, the whisper she'd learned to give to everything that mattered. "I know you're asleep when it happens, I know." Pip turned one amber eye toward her without moving the rest of himself. "But you have to stop." She leaned forward and smoothed the singed corner of her bedroll again, the one she'd already smoothed twice. The wool was thin there now, beginning to be transparent in the way of fabric that has been worried. The edict is here now. It's not something that was happening somewhere else. It's on the board. Those hunters who went through Milford last month, everyone said there was a farm drake pip, something small, something domestic, someone's farm animal, and they took it. She did not say what they'd done with it after taking it. The farm drake had been taken, nothing else had been reported, and the silence around what happened next had a very specific texture that she had learned over the years to read. Pip made the small sound that she had come to think of as his equivalent of a sigh, a tiny creak, almost wooden, somewhere in the back of his throat. He tucked his snout under his tail in the motion she associated with discomfort, with awareness of a thing he could not argue against. She sat with him for a while, watching the light change. She thought about the clay pot. The clay pot had been Pip's invention, in the most literal sense, meaning that she had tried a wooden box, with air holes and a latch, which he had regarded with an expression of withering displeasure before pushing the lid off and climbing out. She had tried a basket, which he had ignored in the way of creatures who do not acknowledge the purposes of objects they find undignified. She had tried a carved wooden hutch that had taken her a week to make with her grandfather's tools and her own uncertain hands, and Pip had sniffed it, sat inside it for approximately 3 minutes, and then climbed out and settled on her windowsill with the bearing of a creature who has made a final decision and will not be revisiting it. The clay pot had been on the sill already. It had belonged to her grandmother, a wide-mouthed thing once used for preserving fruit. It had been sitting on the sill through the winter, empty and forgotten after her grandmother's death, and Sable had left it there because removing it had felt like a small erasure she was not ready to make. Pip had climbed into it, turned around once, and settled with his tail curled against the interior curve of the clay. He had been there ever since. She understood now why. She had understood for a while. The pot sat him at the exact height of the windowsill's outer edge, framing him against the view of the road below, the mud, the stones, the gray-green trickle of river visible between the mill and the Marsh family's fence. He was visible to anyone on the road. He was visible to anyone in the street, anyone looking up at the house, anyone passing. Not tucked away, not hidden behind curtains or kept in the back room or concealed under the beds, visible. On a windowsill, in a clay pot, in full daylight. Among every other ordinary thing on every other ordinary windowsill, in every other ordinary house in Heron's Crossing. Her grandmother's voice again in the partial transcript that was all memory ever gave her. Right in front, right in their eyes. The eye passes over what the mind has already decided isn't there. Pip had understood this instinctively. She was not sure whether it was intelligence, whether he lay awake at night reasoning through concealment strategies, or whether it was something older and more fundamental, the encoded knowledge of a very old kind of creature that had survived long enough to understand how the minds of other kinds of creatures worked. Either way, he had been right. She had tested it. Over and over, she had tested it, and he had been right. The baker's wife's hand, reaching past him for the glazed owl. The merchant from the capital who had rested his horse at their gate for 20 minutes, standing directly below the window, eating an apple and looking everywhere except up. The imperial census taker 3 years ago, coming through every house, nodding every animal and writing lizard, common, mud brown in his ledger with the quick board efficiency of a man who has written lizard, common, mud brown in 300 ledgers and will write it in 300 more. The eye passes over what the mind has already decided isn't there. But she thought, and it was the same but she always arrived at, the same caveat she could never argue away. But what about someone who is specifically looking? The farm drake in Milford had been small. It had been domestic. Someone had lived with it, fed it, cared for it, and still the hunters had found it. The hunters were trained to see through the eye's ordinary laziness. The hunters were professional non-believers in common mud-brown lizard and professional believers in something hiding underneath. 40 days, the scroll said. All draconic creatures to be surrendered or destroyed within 40 days. After that, the hunters would come on their own schedule. She lay in bed that night and could not sleep, which was not unusual. She had been sleeping badly for weeks, ever since the first reports from Milford, the first credible suggestion that the sweep would reach this district. She lay on her back and looked at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the house settling, her parents' voices downstairs, low and private, her mother's careful pauses between sentences that meant she was choosing her words with care, her father's rare, thoughtful contributions, and she thought. She thought about her grandmother who had told her things. Not this thing specifically. Her grandmother had not said someday you will find a dragon and you will have to hide it from an empire. Her grandmother had not been prophetic. She had been practical. She had been the kind of woman who looked at the world as it actually was and passed on the tools for navigating it rather than the prettier and more consoling stories that the world as it actually was tended to make people prefer. She had been dead for 3 years, and Sable missed her with the specific grief of someone who has lost not just a person but an ongoing conversation. A resource of understanding that the world had not replaced. She had been 8 when her grandmother told her about hiding in plain sight. The conversation had been about something else, some small childhood difficulty she could not now remember, some problem of social navigation, some girl in the village who was unkind, some complexity of the schoolroom that had seemed enormous at the time. Her grandmother had listened to the whole thing and then said, in the manner of someone who has decided that the specific problem is less important than the general principle. The best hiding place is somewhere no one thinks to look. And then not behind things, not underneath, right in front, right in their eyes. Sable had not known at 8 that she was filing this away for use. She did not file things away for use. She was not that calculating, not even now. She simply remembered things the way certain people do, the way certain minds work, storing conversations and observations and small particular details not in the service of strategy but out of some native attentiveness to the world, some conviction that things matter and therefore deserve to be held. The things her grandmother told her had lodged because her grandmother meant them. They had the weight of things meant. She turned over in her bed and looked at the window. The clay pot was a dark shape against the lesser darkness of the clouded night sky. Pip was in it, presumably sleeping, his small warmth an invisible fact inside the ceramic curve. She could hear his breathing from across the room, the faintest of sounds, easy as water over stones, regular and living. She thought 40 days. She thought they'll come through every village. She thought he has been on that sill in that pot for 3 years and no one has seen him. She thought, but the hunters will look where other people don't. She thought, what do the hunters look for? This last question opened out into the dark above her, spreading like water, and she followed it where it led because she was 11 years old and she had all night and her mind was the kind that did not rest when a real problem had presented itself. What do they look for? The heat of fire breathing, evidence of scale growth or shed, unusual behavior in livestock or dogs who could smell what humans couldn't, charred materials. Scratches on wood consistent with claw profiles larger than a common lizard's. Charred materials. The edge of her bedroll blackened and thinned. She sat up. Pip's one amber eye opened in the darkness of the clay pot and found her in the dark, with the effortless precision of a creature that sees better in darkness than in light. You have to stop charring things, she said, quietly, firmly, the way she'd learned to say things that mattered without apology and without performance. I know you're sleeping when it happens, I know. But if a hunter looks in this room and sees that bedroll, he's going to ask questions I don't have good answers for and then. She stopped, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't finish it because she didn't want to say the end of it out loud, because there is a kind of protection in not nomming the worst thing, a small irrational mercy you give yourself when the worst thing is too large to look at directly. Pip was watching her. She could not tell in the dark what he understood. She had never been certain how much he understood, and she had been careful not to overestimate it, because overestimating it felt like a kind of sentimental foolishness that could lead her to make real and practical errors. He was a dragon, he was young. He was far from full-grown, and full-grown for his kind was something she had no real information about, could not find in any book in the village's small library, could not ask about without explaining why she was asking. He might understand everything. He might understand only the emotional texture of her voice. She said it anyway because she said everything that mattered to him, regardless. I'm not going to let anything happen to you, she said, but you have to help me. The creak sound came again from the back of his throat. She pulled the charred edge of the bedroll from under her pillow she'd taken to keeping it close, the evidence where she could control it, and she smoothed it again in the dark with her thumbs. The wool was very thin there now. She would have to replace the bedroll soon, and she would have to have a story for where the old one had gone. She lay back down. After a while, Pip's eye closed. After a longer while, she slept. Outside, the village was quiet under its pressing sky, the iron scroll on the notice board catching no light because there was no light to catch. And in 40 days the Empire's counting would begin in earnest. And beyond the village the world was already arranging itself into the new shape that the edict required, the sky emptying, the mountains going silent. 3 generations of extraordinary creatures being surrendered or destroyed or hiding in plain sight on windowsills in clay pots in modest houses, in forgettable places, that no one had yet thought important enough to look at carefully. The crows on the mill roof were still. The weather-vane rooster pointed south and did not move. The river ran flat and gray in the dark, saying nothing. Commander Aldrich Gret had not slept properly in 4 years. This was not a complaint he made to anyone, because he was not a man who made complaints, and also because the not sleeping had become so thoroughly woven into the fabric of his existence that it no longer registered as an absence. It was simply the condition of his nights. A few hours of something shallow and unreliable, interrupted at irregular intervals by the specific quality of wakefulness that is not restlessness but a kind of compulsory attention, as if some part of him had appointed itself night watchman and refused to be stood down. He would lie still in whatever bed a garrison or inn or roadside way station provided, eyes open in the dark, and his mind would conduct its private inventory of the day's events with the thoroughness of a quartermaster counting supplies before a long march. He did not know exactly when this had started. He thought it might have been the 38th dragon. He was not certain. The count had been going smoothly enough until somewhere in the mid-30s, and then it had begun to develop a texture that the earlier numbers had not possessed, a kind of weight that accumulated rather than discharged. He still slept. He still functioned. He was, by every metric the Imperial Hunting Corps employed, one of its most capable and consistently productive commanders. His reports were thorough, his sweeps were complete, his numbers were among the highest in the Western District. He simply did not sleep well. He arrived in the district of Herons crossing on a Thursday in late autumn, with 2 junior hunters riding behind him and the particular mental state that he had learned to recognize in himself during the longer and more remote sweeps, a flatness, a distance, as if he were observing his own actions through slightly smoked glass. He had learned not to fight this state. It was protective, possibly, a form of efficiency. It kept the personal out of the professional, which was what the work required and what he had trained himself to provide. The district comprised 11 villages, 4 farmsteads, 2 mill settlements, and 1 minor garrison town that had been emptied of almost everything interesting by a series of poor harvests 3 years running. He had already swept 8 of the 11 villages. He had found nothing which was consistent with the pattern. The remote western districts, the poor districts, the districts that the great old dragon families had never found attractive, tended to yield nothing because there had never been much there to find. The great sweeps, the ones that had filled the quarterly reports with impressive numbers and earned promotions for everyone involved, had happened in the mountain corridors, in the deep forest valleys, in the marsh territories where the river dragons had nested for centuries. What was left now was the granular work, the fine-toothed comb drawn through the unremarkable places, looking for the small things that the large sweeps had missed or not bothered with, the domestic breeds, the half-breeds, the solitary juveniles, the things that had been hidden by ordinary people in ordinary places out of attachment or habit or simple refusal to accept that the world had reorganized itself around new terms. The granular work was, in its way, harder. The mountain dragons had been vast and terrible and ancient, and they had fought back in ways that made their ending, when it came, something at least approaching epic, something that could be written about afterward in the military reports without the language feeling obscene. The granular work offered no such frame. The granular work was knocking on farmhouse doors and checking buyers, and asking quiet people quiet questions and sometimes finding, at the back of a cellar or the top of a hayloft, something small and frightened that had been loved by someone standing directly behind you trying not to show it on their face. He preferred not to think about the granular work in these terms. He thought about it anyway at night in whatever bed the road provided. Heron's Crossing presented itself to him as exactly what it was, a forgettable nothing of a place, the kind of settlement that existed because the land permitted it and people are persistent rather than because anything had drawn them there with purpose. 43 houses, a mill, a cold gray river. A single in that also functioned as the village's only tavern, its only gathering place, and judging by the mismatched chairs in the common room, possibly its only furniture repository for items that other buildings had decided they no longer wanted. The innkeeper was a broad, careful woman named Merritt who had the specific demeanor of someone who has learned through long experience that the safest response to official visitors is a combination of scrupulous courtesy and radical blankness. She showed him to a room without comment, brought him a meal without being asked, and answered every question he put to her about the village's inhabitants with the unhurried specificity of a person who has nothing to hide and intends to prove it through sheer detail. Yes, she knew every household. Yes, she knew every animal kept on every property. No, she had not seen or heard anything that might suggest a draconic presence, not in the 6 years she had been running the inn. He thanked her, he ate his meal, he went over his notes for the district. The prescribed procedure for village sweeps was methodical and had been designed by people who understood that thoroughness was more valuable than speed. Day 1. Arrive, establish accommodation, conduct initial inquiries with the innkeeper, the miller, the blacksmith, and the eldest village elder. These 4 categories of person were considered to represent the nodes through which most village information flowed. Day 2, walk the main road and the 2 nearest side roads, noting any irregularity, any structure that hadn't been recorded in the census, any animal behavior that warranted closer examination. Day 3, conduct door-to-door inquiries if Day 2 had yielded anything worth following up, otherwise depart. He had done this procedure in 8 villages. He had done it in dozens of villages before this district and in the districts before that. His body knew the rhythm of it the way a miller's body knows the rhythm of the wheel. He went to bed on Thursday night and lay in the dark, conducting his inventory, and eventually achieved something adjacent to sleep. Friday morning came gray and cold, the sky delivering on the previous day's promise of bleakness. He ate a breakfast of porridge and bread in the inn's common room, alone, his junior hunters, Pell, and a quiet young woman named Joss who had been with him for 6 months and had developed the ability to be usefully invisible, eating at the other end of the table without requiring conversation. He had trained them both in the baseline competencies of the work, and one of those competencies was understanding when the commander required silence. He had his notes from the previous evening's inquiries. The miller had told him about livestock. The blacksmith had described all 4 of his working horses with the loving precision of a man for whom horses were the organizing principle of existence. The village elder, a weathered man of at least 75, had offered a lengthy history of Heron's Crossing that encompassed 2 floods, a disputed land boundary, and the installation of the current mill wheel, none of which were relevant. He had listened to all of it. You listened, because occasionally the irrelevant information became relevant by virtue of what it surrounded, and because not listening was a form of carelessness that he did not permit himself. The innkeeper had said, "Nothing of that kind in Heron's Crossing, Commander, not ever that I've known." He had written this down and moved on. After breakfast, he put on his gray coat, the heavy one, the official one with the imperial insignia on the collar, not because he needed the authority it conferred, but because the cold required something substantial, and he walked out onto the main road. The village went about its morning around him. He was accustomed to the effect of his coat, his bearing, his professional stillness on the inhabitants of swept villages. People did not avoid him exactly, avoidance would have been its own signal, but they organized themselves around him with the particular care of people trying to appear unconcerned. The man mending a fence 3 houses down worked with the slightly exaggerated focus of someone demonstrating how thoroughly absorbed in fence mending he was. The 2 women talking at the corner of the market square wrapped up their conversation with a naturalness that was perhaps 10% too natural. A child who had been running in circles for the evident pure joy of running in circles stopped running in circles. He noted these things without judgment. They were human, these behaviors. He would have behaved similarly in their position. He walked the main road at an even pace, hands clasped behind his back, his eyes moving in the systematic pattern he'd developed over years. Ground level, mid-height, upper windows, rooflines, back to ground. He was looking, as always, for the small wrongnesses. Not the large obvious things. The large obvious things were gone now mostly, had been gone for 2 years. The great worms and the fire drakes and the mountain serpents who could not have hidden if they'd wanted to and had not wanted to anyway, had died fighting or had simply gone somewhere the Empire had not yet reached. He was looking for the residue, the evidence of the small and the domestic and the stubbornly attached. He looked at windows. He looked at them professionally, systematically, with no particular expectation, in the same way that he looked at everything, not hopping to find something, not hopping not to find something, simply registering what was there to be registered. He had trained hope out of the process years ago. Hope in either direction was a distortion. You looked, you saw what you saw, you reported accordingly. The Fen house was the 7th house on the right side of the main road. It was a modest 2-story structure in the common local style. Timber-framed, whitewashed plaster between the beams, the whitewash going slightly green at the base where the winter damp had gotten into it. A vegetable garden on the south side, the beds turned over for the season and mulched with straw. A weather vane on the roof shaped like a rooster, which had stopped turning, the mechanism seized probably by the cold of the last few nights. A window on the upper floor facing the road with something on the sill. He was past the house before his eyes had finished processing what they'd seen. He stopped. He did not turn around immediately. He stood still in the road with his back to the house, and he ran the image back through his mind the way he had trained himself to run incomplete observations back slowly, without forcing it, letting the details surface in the order they wanted to rather than the order he preferred. The window, the sill, the clay pot, wide-mouthed old, the reddish-brown of river clay, the thing in the pot which was browns, small, the length of a large man's forearm approximately. The eye passed over it almost automatically, because it was what it appeared to be, a common mud-brown lizard on a common clay pot on a common windowsill. And the eye knows how to pass over common things. The eye is very good at common things. The eye has been passing over common things since before any particular pair of eyes existed and will keep doing it long after. The light. He stood still in the road and thought about the light. The morning light had been at a specific angle, low and raking, the way autumn light came in the hours after sunrise, hitting the road from the southeast and throwing long thin shadows. At the moment he had passed the window, that light had been hitting the creature in the clay pot at an angle that was, purely by accident, not the angle from which common mud-brown lizards are ordinarily seen. From directly below, which was where he had been, walking the road, the raking light had come in under the angle of the creature's jawline, and had, for precisely the half-second it took him to pass from the approach to directly below to past, caught the eyes. Amber. Not the dull amber of polished riverstones, not the amber of old glass, the amber of lit things, the amber of light inside rather than light reflected from outside. He stood in the road. Behind him, 6 paces on, Pell had stopped walking and was waiting with the trained patience of a junior hunter who has learned that when the commander stops suddenly, you stop and you wait and you say nothing. The creature on the sill had turned away. He had processed this in the run back, alongside the amber of the eyes, a very small, very deliberate movement, the head turning from the road-facing angle to a road-adjacent angle, a motion of exactly the degree required to redirect the eyes away from anything below, away from the direction from which observation was most likely. He was standing in the road, and he was thinking about emotion. He had watched over the course of his career a great many creatures attempt to conceal themselves from him. He had watched large things go still. He had watched intelligent things attempt misdirection. He had watched creatures of considerable age and cunning deploy instincts refined over centuries. He knew what purposeful stillness looked like. He knew the difference between an animal that had gone still because it was startled and an animal that had gone still because it had made a decision. The motion he had processed in the run back was neither stillness nor misdirection. It was something more interesting. It was a motion that said, I have been visible. I have been visible deliberately and consistently and strategically because being visible in the right way is the same as being invisible. But you just came close enough to the right angle that the calculation required adjustment. So here is the adjustment. He stood in the road for a long time. He was aware at the edges of this thinking of his own breathing, measured, unchanged, giving nothing away. Because he was a professional and he was standing in public, and there was a child somewhere behind that window, and he was standing in the road thinking about what he had seen. Commander Pell said behind him, something the matter. He thought about the 47 notches. Not in a sentimental way, he had trained sentiment out of the work along with hope, or had tried to, had achieved something in that direction that functioned reasonably well in most conditions. He thought about the notches in the practical way he thought about most things, which was, what do they represent? What do they say about the category of thing I am currently considering? What does the arithmetic of them suggest about what I am doing here in this road with this information and this decision? 47. He had killed 47 dragons. The Imperial Hunting Corps had collectively killed several thousand. The sky was empty. The marshes were quiet. The deep forests where the sound of wing beats had been reported by foresters for generations were quiet. The work was substantially complete by any rational accounting. What remained, what the granular sweep was finding was this, the small ones, the domestic ones, the ones that were the size of a large man's forearm and lived in clay pots on windowsills in villages. The morning after the hunter left, Sable Fen woke before anyone else in the house and lay very still in her bed and listened to the quality of the silence. She had learned over 3 years of this particular vigilance to read silence the way other people read faces, not as the mere absence of sound, but as a textured thing, full of information, full of implication, shaped differently depending on what had recently passed through it or what was still moving beneath its surface. The silence of an ordinary morning had a specific weight and temperature. The distant river, the mill wheel if the miller was already up, birdsong in its seasonal register, her father's footsteps in the room below when he rose for the animals. She knew this silence intimately. She could read its variations the way a sailor reads the water. The silence of this morning was ordinary. She lay in it and let the ordinariness settle into her like warm water into cold stone, slowly, from the outside in, taking longer than she would have liked because some part of her, some stationed and wary part that had been posted at the inside of her chest for the last 3 days, did not immediately believe in ordinary silences anymore. Believed instead that the ordinary silence was a staging ground for something that was not ordinary, that the gray dawn quiet was the quiet before rather than the quiet of. She made herself breathe in, out. She counted to 30 in her head, the way her grandmother had taught her for different reasons in a different life. When you are frightened, count. Not because the counting changes anything, but because your mind cannot fully occupy the fear and the counting at the same time, and the counting at least has an end. At 30, she sat up. Pip was on the sill. He was always on the sill in the mornings. This was one of the constants of his existence that she had come to rely upon, the way you rely upon the sun being where you expect it, rising in the east, behaving itself. He faced the road. His small chest moved with his breathing. The dawn light, still thin and indeterminate, fell across his scales and did precisely what it always did. Made him look like part of the sill, part of the pot, part of the ordinary arrangement of ordinary things on an ordinary windowsill in an ordinary house. She crossed the floor on bare feet and stood beside the pot and looked down the road. The eastern road was empty. She looked at it for a long time, at the absence of gray coat and gray horse and the two junior hunters who had been a constant presence at the edges of her peripheral vision since Thursday. The absence was so complete, so clean, that it felt almost suspicious, as if something that large and threatening ought to leave more mark on a road when it departed. But the road gave her nothing. Wheel ruts from the autumn market carts, a scatter of wet leaves, the particular gray of packed earth after rain. Gone. She sat down on the floor beside the sill, her back against the wall, her knees drawn up, and she pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and breathed. She did not cry. She was not, in general, a crier, not because she lacked the feeling that preceded crying, but because the feeling tended to arrive in her as something more internal and pressurized, something that needed time and quiet rather than release. She sat on the floor with her hands over her eyes, and she felt the last 3 days moving through her in reverse. The careful dinners where she had eaten everything on her plate and spoken in complete sentences, and answered her parents' questions about her schoolwork with the deliberate normalcy of a person doing an extremely convincing impression of a child who had nothing on her mind. The 2 nights of lying awake with Pip breathing quietly on the sill and her own heart conducting its irregular, panicked business in her chest. And the moment, the central, definitive, everything hinges on this moment, of standing at the window on Friday morning and watching the hunter stop. She had seen him stop. She had been at the window because she was always at the window in the mornings. It was her habit, her ritual, the first thing she did after dressing: stand at the window and check the road and check Pip and assess the day. She had been standing there when the gray-coated figure on the road had slowed and then stopped, and she had known with absolute immediacy, without any period of uncertainty or self-persuasion, exactly what had caused the stopping. She had looked at Pip. Pip had been in his pot facing the road in the raking morning light, and the raking morning light had been, she had noticed it herself, had been meaning to adjust for it, coming in at the particular low southeastern angle that hit his eyes wrong, hit them from underneath rather than from the side, the angle that caught the amber in them and made them do the thing she spent most of her energy ensuring they did not do, which was glow. She had reached for him, her hand had been 3 inches from his body when the hunter walked on. She had not moved for a very long time after that. She had stood at the window with her hands suspended in midair, watching the gray coat continue down the road, watching it not turn back, watching it become smaller and more distant, and she had waited for it to turn back until it was too far away to turn back convincingly, and then she had put her hand down and she had sat on the edge of her bed. And she had stayed there for a while without thinking about anything in particular, because thinking about anything in particular was more than she was capable of just then. Now, sitting on the floor with the dawn coming in around her and the ordinary silence settled and the road empty, she was capable of thinking about it. He had seen. She was certain of this. The stop had been too specific, too precisely located, too much the stop of someone who has registered something and is processing it rather than the stop of someone whose horse has stumbled or whose attention has been caught by something unrelated. She had watched him stand in the road with his back to the house for a long time, too long for it to be nothing. And she had watched the young hunter behind him ask a question, and she had not been able to hear the answer, but she had watched the gray-coated figure's back and the set of his shoulders and the way he stood, and she had read what she could from all of it. He had seen, and then he had walked on, and then he had left. She sat with this fact and turned it over in her mind the way she turned interesting stones over in her hands, looking at every face. Why? This was the question that the fact produced and then refused to answer. She was 11 years old, would be 12 in the spring, and she was old enough to understand that the hunter's not reporting was a choice, and that choices had reasons, and that reasons were, in principle, discoverable. She was also old enough to understand that she would probably never know this particular reason. It belonged to someone she would almost certainly never speak to, someone who had passed through her life at a distance of perhaps 30 feet, and had held her most important secret in his hands for a moment on a cold autumn morning, and had, for reasons that were entirely his own, let it go. She would never know why. This not knowing settled into her alongside the relief and became part of it, a relief that was not clean, not simple, not the pure uncomplicated exhale of danger past, but something more complicated. A relief that was grateful and also humbled. A relief that understood it had been the beneficiary of something it had not earned and could not fully account for and would carry accordingly. She uncovered her eyes, she looked at Pip. Pip was looking at her with the attentive amber steadiness that she had come to understand was his version of many different things depending on context, curiosity, contentment, waiting, watching, and in this context she read it as what she believed it was, awareness. He knew something had happened. He had been watching the road that morning with a stillness that went beyond his ordinary stillness, a stillness so thorough and committed that it had briefly made her doubt her own eyes, doubt the genuineness of his animation, doubt that he was a living thing at all and not simply a very well-made imitation of one. He had knowns. How much he knew was the question she could never fully answer and had long since stopped needing to. He knew enough. He always knew enough. He had been knowing enough, quietly and without fanfare, since the night he had hatched in the clay pot and looked at her with those amber eyes and stepped onto her hand. There had been a contract in that step, she understood now, not a contract in any language, not in any form that law would recognize, but a contract in the oldest and most binding sense. The sense of two creatures who have looked at each other and understood something and cannot now unknow it. She reached out and rested one finger gently against the side of his jaw. He was warm. He was always warm, the warmth that was not borrowed from the sun but made from within. The warmth that was, if you knew how to feel it, if you had held him often enough to calibrate yourself to the specific register of it, unmistakably alive in a way that went beyond biology, that was the warmth of a thing that was itself rather than merely a member of a category. "All right," she said softly, "all right." She turned 12 in the spring, as expected, and 13 the spring after that, and 14 the spring after that. Time moved through Heron's Crossing in the way time moves through small and unchanging places, not quickly, not slowly, but with a sort of steady, unremarkable accumulation, like silt depositing at the bottom of a slow river, building depth without drama. The Empire's quarterly sweeps continued. 2 more hunters came through Heron's Crossing in the year following the gray-coated commander's visit. Different hunters, younger, part of a larger district sweep that had been prompted by a report from 3 villages east of a concealed drake found in a millhouse. They stayed one night each time, conducted their prescribed inquiries, and left. Both of them passed the Fen house on the main road. Neither of them stopped. She watched them from the window both times. The second time, she noticed that Pip had tucked his chin slightly and half closed his eyes as the hunter passed directly below, not fully closing them, because full closure would have made him look suddenly less like a living mud lizard and more like a sleeping one, and a sleeping mud lizard on a windowsill in autumn was slightly less plausible than an awake one. He had managed the angle of his half-closed eyes so that the amber was visible but not catching, present but muted. The ember glow reduced to something that the eye could process as dull, organic color rather than lit interior fire. She had watched him do this from 2 feet away, and she had marveled at it with the specific quality of marveling she had developed over 4 years of knowing him. A marveling that was also ordinary, that was also matter of fact, that was the marveling of someone who has lived long enough with the extraordinary to have learned to carry it without dropping it. She began, around the time she turned 13, to understand the deeper lesson. Not the lesson she had thought she was learning in the beginning, stay small, stay hidden, stay invisible, stay safe, but the thing underneath it. The lesson that Pip had been demonstrating since the day he had climbed into that clay pot and refused every alternative, that visibility is not the same as sight. She had been thinking about this wrong in the beginning. She had been thinking about it as a trick, a tactic, a clever deployment of the enemy's blind spot, which it was, but it was also more than that, and the more than that was what she was only beginning to be old enough to comprehend. The hunter had seen Pip. His eyes had moved directly and correctly to him. He had not been tricked in the sense of having been deceived about the existence of a thing. He had been fully, accurately informed about the thing's existence by his own functioning eyes. And then he had made a different decision about what to do with that information. Visibility is not the same as sight, and sight is not the same as the decision about what to make of what you see. These are 3 separate things. The first is physics. The second is biology and training. The third is something else, something that lives in the human being doing the looking, something that no imperial edict and no core training manual could fully reach or regulate, because it was the part of a person that was still their own even when they had given almost everything else to a role, a rank, an institution, a 19-year career of counted notches. The hunter had seen Pip, And then some part of him, some interior part that was still his own, had made a choice. She thought about this for years. She would, she suspected, think about it for the rest of her life. She thought about it when she looked at Pip, who grew. He grew slowly and in stages, which was either the nature of his kind or the nature of his circumstances or some combination of both, and she could never be certain which. There were periods of months where he seemed entirely static, filling the clay pot with the same compact completeness he always had, his dimensions fixed, his weight in her hands unchanged. And then she would pick him up one morning and feel the shift, subtle, not dramatic, not the overnight doubling of size that the old stories described in The Young of Great Worms, but present, undeniable, the slight extra length of him, the slight additional density, the way her hand's grip calibrated itself automatically to accommodate the change. By the time she was 12, he was the length of her forearm extended, not just her hand and forearm together, but from elbow to fingertip, a creature of real and appreciable size that was still, through some sustained miracle of presentation and the good grace of a village that had collectively decided not to look too closely at the Fen girl's windowsill pet, passing as an unusually large common lizard. By 13, he was the length of her whole leg from hip to foot when he stretched himself out, which he did occasionally in the warmth of summer afternoons slowly, with the elaborate pleasure of a creature indulging itself before folding himself back into the clay pot with what she could only describe as an air of smug satisfaction at having accomplished the fold. The clay pot should not have contained him anymore by any rational measurement. He made it contain him anyway. She had stopped questioning how. By 14, the clay pot had moved from the windowsill to the floor, which she had explained to her mother as a decision to repurpose the sill for actual plant cultivation. Her mother had accepted this without visible suspicion, which said something either about the quality of the explanation or about what her mother had decided, on some private and unexamined level, to believe. Sable was increasingly of the opinion that her mother knew more than she said and had made her own quiet contract with the situation, and that this contract would not survive explicit acknowledgement and so would never be explicitly acknowledged by either of them. This was love of a particular domestic variety, not the love that names things and discusses them, but the love that makes room for them without requiring their identification. Her mother moved around the large decorative pot in the corner of Sable's room with a careful neutrality that was itself a form of declaration. She did not say anything about the warmth the pot gave off. She did not say anything about the sound, late at night, very soft, very low, barely sound at all, more like the memory of sound that sometimes came from the corner. She did not say anything about the morning she had come into Sable's room before her daughter was awake and found the window glass on the inside touched with a thin crystalline pattern, not frost, the wrong texture, the wrong color, more like the delicate mineral residue left by very hot breath on cold glass. She had looked at the window for a moment, and then she had called Sable for breakfast, and she had never mentioned it. The imperial sweeps thinned and eventually stopped, which was information of a particular kind. The Corps, whose quarterly reports Sable had begun to read, they were posted at the garrison town 12 miles east, available to the public as a matter of imperial transparency. A transparency that assumed the public would find the reports tedious rather than useful, moved from active searching to maintenance protocol, which meant that the formal hunting phase of the edict's implementation was considered substantially complete. The sky had been empty for 3 years. The marshes had been empty for 4. The Corps quarterly reports no longer tallied discoveries and disposals. They tallied compliance metrics, citizen reports, and what they called residual risk assessments, the bureaucratic language of an operation winding itself down and reframing its continued existence as precautionary rather than active. She read all of this carefully, in the library of the garrison town on the days her mother allowed her the longer walk, sitting at the reading table with the Corps reports open beside the district census documents and the agricultural surveys, building a picture. She had discovered, somewhere around the age of 12, that official documents were most useful when read against each other, that the thing one document didn't say was often the thing another document said in different language, and that the space between them was where the actual truth lived. The actual truth as best she could assemble it, the Corps believed the work was done. They were not wrong exactly. What they had found they had dealt with. What remained, if anything remained, which their assessments rated at low probability, was too small, too hidden, too thoroughly embedded in the unremarkable ordinary life of unremarkable ordinary places to be worth the continued resource allocation of active sweeps. Low probability, she thought, not zero. She kept reading. She was 14 the morning Pip first showed her what he was. Not in any dramatic sense, there was no great revelation, no transformation, no sudden shedding of the mud brown for something magnificent and scaled in fire colors. He was simply himself more fully, for the first time in her presence rather than in the private hours she suspected he spent when she was sleeping. She had woken very early on a summer morning, earlier than usual, to the particular quality of pre-dawn light that is not quite darkness and not quite light but some thin honest state in between. And she had looked at the corner where the clay pot now sat on the floor, and she had seen Pip not in the pot but beside it, stretched full length on the floor, extended, his scales catching what light there was, which was almost none. Except that the scales themselves seemed to be doing something with the nothing light that scales were not supposed to be able to do. They were luminous, faintly deeply, the way certain dark stones are luminous in water, not shining, not glowing, not the amber lantern intensity of his eyes, but something subtler and more essential. A light that was part of the material itself rather than a reflection or an emission, the light of something that is made from light as much as from matter. And his eyes were open, and they were full amber, full lit, not muted, not managed, not performing common mud-brown lizard for any audience, just what they actually were. Burning quietly in the pre-dawn of a summer morning in a 14-year-old girl's bedroom. He looked at her. She looked at him. She thought, there you are. Not surprised, not frightened. Not even precisely awed, though the thing she felt had awe in its composition. More like recognition, the recognition of something you have known was present all along, that you have been in relationship with all along, that you have made your central organizing fact all along, but that you have never quite seen in its fullness, never quite encountered unmediated by the performance and the management and the constant ongoing work of being invisible. He had let her see him. She understood that this was a choice, the same order of choice as his. Of all the choices either of them had made in 4 years, this was perhaps the most deliberate and the most trusting. He had let her see him without the mud brown, without the pot, without the careful angle of half-closed eyes. He had been himself for her, in the thin, honest light before the day required anything of either of them. She slid out of bed and sat on the floor beside him, cross-legged in her nightshirt in the pre-dawn, and she rested her hand along the length of his side. And he was warm, so much warmer than he had ever felt against her palm before, the warmth not of an animal's metabolic heat but of something more like a forge warmth. A warmth with depth to it, with layers, with the suggestion of vast reserves held carefully in check. She sat with him until the light changed. He grew faster after that, as if the showing of himself had released something, some internal constraint, some accommodation he had been making for years to the dimensions of the life available to him, and the growth had a different quality than the slow, careful increments of the previous 4 years. Not reckless, not sudden, but real and sustained and no longer apologetic. By the end of that summer, the clay pot was a gesture rather than a container. He still sat in it, or sat around it, curling his considerable length around its circumference with the fond possessiveness of a creature that understands sentiment if not always practicality. She did not remove it. She did not think she would ever remove it, not as long as it was hers to keep. Her parents had not come into her room in some time, she had noticed. This was managed, on her mother's part, with the same careful neutrality as everything else. A sudden development of the habit of knocking and waiting, an increased reliance on calling from the hallway rather than entering, a general and unexplained redistribution of domestic traffic away from the upper room at the back of the house. Her father had, she thought, slightly less knowledge of the situation and slightly less willingness to deploy the not knowing, but he followed her mother's lead in most things, and he followed it in this. She was grateful. She was also aware that she was asking something of them that they had not agreed to in any explicit sense, that the protection she was taking from their deliberate blindness was protection she had no right to assume and no way to repay except by being, in all other respects, a daughter worth protecting. She tried to be that. She was, she thought, reasonably succeeding. The autumn she turned 15 brought the first real cold of several years, the kind of cold that arrived in earnest in October and did not negotiate, that frosted the windows by night and kept the river low and steel-colored through the days, that drove the crows off the mill roof and made the village contract into itself. Smoke from every chimney, everyone moving a little faster between doors. It also brought a morning she had been half expecting and fully dreading, and also, somewhere beneath the dread, half waiting for the way you half wait for the thing that is both the loss of something and the proof of what the thing was. She woke to an absence of pressure at the foot of her bed, where Pip had begun sleeping on cold nights, curled at the foot like an enormous dog, his warmth making her extra blanket unnecessary. The foot of the bed was empty and cold. She sat up. The window was open. She had closed it the night before, she was certain. She had closed it against the cold, and now it was open. Not flung wide, but open by the exact margin of a creature departing with care rather than urgency, leaving the minimum necessary gap behind it. She crossed to the window and looked out. The roof below the window, the low-sloped section of the kitchen roof, which had always provided a ledge of sorts, showed evidence. The frost on the shingles was disturbed in a pattern she read without difficulty, a long sinuous track, the impression of weight and warmth, moving from the window's edge to the far end of the kitchen roof and then past the edge of the roof nothing. Just air. Just the dark, cold sky of very early morning, the stars still present in the west though fading in the east. She looked at the sky for a long time. She checked herself carefully. In the way she had learned to check herself, she was not afraid. The fear she had expected to feel was not what arrived. What arrived was something more complex and more final and more tender than fear. The feeling of a thing completed. The feeling of a thing that had been exactly what it was for exactly as long as it needed to be and had now moved into its next form. He was not gone. She knew this with the same chest knowledge that had known what the egg was when she held it at the river. He was not gone the way her grandmother was gone, removed from the world, irretrievable, present only in fragments and the echo of her voice in remembered sentences. He was gone the way things go when they become themselves more fully, when the life that was holding them gently and carefully and in full knowledge of its own temporariness finally, at the right moment, opens its hands. She had opened her hands. Or he had stepped off them. She was not certain. There was a difference. She dressed in the dark and went downstairs without waking her parents, and walked out into the cold morning and stood in the road outside the house and looked north. The mountains were not visible, too far, too dark, too hidden in the early morning haze that the frost produced, but she knew where they were. 12 years old and she had known where they were, the same chest knowledge, the same irrevocable sense of direction. North and west, past the district lines, past the garrison town's tidy cartographic certainties, past the drawn edges of the empire's careful interest, into the country that the surveys described with the vague language of things that had not been thoroughly investigated. Upland territory, low strategic value, limited agricultural potential, sparse settlement. Sparse settlement. No one thought worth looking at carefully. She stood in the cold road in the pre-dawn and she looked north at the place where the mountains weren't visible yet. And she thought about a hunter standing in a road on a cold autumn morning 4 years ago, looking at amber light, making a private and irrevocable choice that she would never fully understand but would carry with her for the rest of her life. She thought we are all in the end making choices about what to make of what we see. She thought some of those choices are ones we have to live with, some of them are ones we get to live with. She thought he got to live with his. She hoped that was true. She had no way of knowing and would never have a way of knowing, and this was one of the facts she had made her peace with, or was making her peace with, in the ongoing way that peace is made, not once but continuously, not completely but sufficiently. The sky in the east was beginning to come lighter. She stayed in the road until it was fully light, until the village was waking around her and smoke was beginning from the chimneys and the mill wheel was starting its slow morning turn. And then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table, and her mother, who had come downstairs quietly and put the kettle on without comment, set a cup of tea in front of her and sat down across from her and wrapped her own hands around her own cup and said nothing. They sat together in the morning. After a while her mother said, "Will you eat something?" "Yes," Sable said. Her mother got up and made porridge, and they ate together in the warm kitchen with the frost making its patterns on the window glass. Ordinary frost, this time, the cold gray-white of winter on glass, nothing luminous or impossible about it. And outside the window the road was empty and the clay pot was still upstairs in the corner of her room, and the mountains were somewhere north and west behind the morning haze, green and cold and vast and unhurried. Full of the kind of silence that has never been empty but only patient. She ate her porridge. She looked at the frost on the window. She thought, all right. She thought, all right.